Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and this week we're looking at the UK general election of 2024. How did its remarkable result come about? What does this tell us about underlying forces in British politics? And what lessons might we take away for the future? Hello, my name is Alan Rennick, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. The 2024 UK general election was exceptional. Labour secured one of the largest majorities in the House of Commons ever, but on the lowest vote share for any winning party ever. The Conservatives suffered their worst defeat in modern times. Votes were more fragmented across political parties than ever before. So, how could such an outcome come about? What were the immediate drivers of this result? And what happened to the underlying dynamics of voting behaviour? While a recent special issue of our partner journal, the Political Quarterly, explores these three questions, and indeed many more besides. And in the latest of our special occasional series of episodes focusing on new research published in the Political Quarterly, I'm delighted to be joined by a truly stellar panel of three contributors to that special issue. Jane Green is Professor of Political Science and British Politics at Nuffield College, University of Oxford, and co-director of the British Election Study. Marta Miuri is doctoral student in the Department of Politics at the University of Manchester and also a research officer at Nuffield College, Oxford. And Paula Surridge is Professor of Political Sociology at the University of Bristol. Jane, Marta, and Paula, welcome all to UCL Uncovering Politics. It's just fantastic to have such a crack team of election experts joining us today. And could we maybe start with a bit of a scene setter? I said a little in my introduction there about some of the things that I found most striking about this election. But what would you highlight as points that we ought to be paying attention to in our discussion today? Marta, do you want to get us going?
Hi, thank you. I think there's so many very noteworthy things about the outcome of the 2024 election, but the key thing to understand about the context is that voters were very, very unhappy with their incumbents across the UK nations in an exceptional manner. So the Tories in England, the SNP in Scotland, and to some degree Labour in Wales, voters were very unhappy with their incumbents, blamed their incumbents for how bad things were doing, and they punished their incumbents in each of the nations. And I think this is a key theme to then understand implementation, tactical voting on different levels.
Great. Thank you very much. Jane, what would you highlight?
Very much as Marta has expressed, but I think perhaps to think about it in a long-term context too. And I know that Paula has identified the trend, and, both of us have been chatting about the trend towards fragmentation over time. Now, the thing with that trend is that it's going to have different characteristics in different elections. Now, so people have been rejecting the two largest parties over time. We then need to look at 2017 and 2019 as exceptions to that trend, but 2024 as then returning to that trend, but with its very particular features as Marta outlined. So strong anti-incumbent voting, then translating into a very, very, very strong seat-based outcome for the Labour Party, totally exceptional in terms of the disproportionality. So that trend has different expressions. The context then was the all-important thing to understand just how that fragmentation then materialised and gave Labour its majority.
Lots to get our teeth into there. Thank you. And Paula?
So I agree absolutely with everything that Marta and Jane said, but I'd add two extra things that I think we need to keep an eye on coming out of this election, kind of moving forwards rather than backwards into the context. And that is, first of all, as Jane highlighted, the combined vote share for the two main parties was historically low. But actually the combined vote share for the three main parties, if you stick the Liberal Democrats and their predecessors in there, was also historically low. So there was a real willingness to go outside the mainstream, or what had been the mainstream of British politics, and look at other parties. So that fragmentation went even further perhaps than it has done before into the independents, some of the minor parties, the Greens, and obviously Reform. And then the other thing...
You had a stat in your article saying that those parties and the independents collectively got over 30% of the vote. Is that right?
Yeah.
which I
Yes.
hadn't realised. And it's just extraordinary. A third, very nearly a third of the vote.
Yeah. And then the other thing, which none of us will be able to talk very much about, but it would be completely remiss not to have it mentioned somewhere on the podcast, is turnout at the election. The fact that turnout was very, very low. It's not something we've been able to analyse, even really begin to analyse yet. But I think it would be a shame not to at least have mentioned it at some point.
Absolutely, yeah. So turnout was pretty much exactly 60%, which was just fractionally above the lowest ever, which was in 2001. Jane?
Yeah, I mean, totally important, as Paula says, and part of the context that matters. So two things, disillusionment and a foregone conclusion. And so that combination of disillusionment, pushing people away from the mainstream, and pushing people away from the government in the UK, but also the SNP in Scotland. But that sense too that the election was a foregone conclusion. And so if you were thinking tactically who to vote for, you're thinking, why was it that the Liberal Democrat vote share was low, but their seat bonus was so big? Same for Labour. It's very much about understanding how people perceive the race.
Good. That gives us a good starting point of issues for us to explore. Let's now go deeper into your article, Jane and Marta. And that article focuses on some of those key themes that we've just been talking about around how it was that Labour was able to win such a resounding victory on the basis of such a low share of the vote. I guess if that's the question, Jane, what's the basic answer that we can give to that question?
The first thing is that clearly, if you're getting that kind of seat level, 411 MPs on 34% of the vote, then the first thing we see, and we can compare this to the past, is just how efficient Labour's vote was. So that means that they're not wasting votes where they don't matter, where they're not actually decisive in winning MPs. In actual fact, their vote went down in many of their safest seats. That helps to make it possible that they can have a more efficient vote. And their vote went up a little bit, or even they won some seats from the Conservatives where their vote share went down. So that level of efficiency was absolutely critical. Now, how did that come about? We identify three things. The first is that really crucial split on the right. That's the most significant thing that's happening in British politics now. It's the biggest change, combined with that disproportionality and that fragmentation. So it's the Conservative vote collapsing to the right, primarily, that helps us understand why in a first-past-the-post system, the threshold was so much lower for Labour to be able to just get just across that threshold. And the other massive factor is then tactical voting. And our analysis showed that that was much stronger on the left between progressive parties. That's partly to do with the anti-incumbent vote, so you don't see voters on the right behaving in the same way to protect or indeed save the Conservatives in many constituencies. And then lastly, Labour's swing was greater in Scotland. And that was significant for that disproportionality story and also for the seat gains they made on their vote share. But we can understand that through voters rejecting two governments, the SNP in Scotland and also the Conservatives in Westminster. And in Scotland, that double incumbency problem really was exceptional. It was the first time that Scottish voters...
So it sounds like all of those various factors are related to this anti-incumbency point that you highlighted right at the start. So you've got that double anti-incumbency in Scotland. I'm really interested that you linked the strength of tactical voting between left and right and the difference in the strength of tactical voting to that anti-incumbency factor as well, that there wasn't tactical voting on the right. You're suggesting not because there's some kind of incompatibility between Conservatives and Reform, but because in this particular election, the Conservatives were somewhat toxic, I guess, being the incumbents, and therefore Reform supporters were not going there.
Yeah, and you also have to, when you think about tactical voting, and Marta, I'm sure, will have so much to say on this, but you think about tactical voting, you have to obviously believe that your party isn't going to win and therefore vote for another party that's kind of best placed to defeat a party you're not favourable towards. So we also have to factor in people's perceptions of the race, whether people correctly perceive the local race. And this is one of the reasons the Liberal Democrats could do so well in terms of seats, but not in votes. That disproportionality, that seat gain compared to vote gain was also very exceptional for the Lib Dems. Hence, you can see the sort of you look in vote shares and you see that it wasn't necessarily a vote for those mainstream parties as Paula identified, but its seat shares, it really was. And that's because people understood the local race so much better. They knew that the Liberal Democrats were better placed to defeat the Tories than other parties, and therefore the Liberal Democrats got those votes. So very much consistent with that anti-incumbency context, also consistent with not everybody identifying the local tactical context correctly, of course, but many doing so and then being mobilised in order to defeat Conservatives in the main.
And Marta, you've looked in detail at those patterns of tactical voting, particularly among the parties on the left. Either?
So the way we looked at it is that we used British election study data where people could say how much they liked different parties, rank them on a scale. And we looked at people who preferred another party, but didn't vote for their preferred party because a party that they liked less was more likely to win in their constituency. We see this happening a lot between Labour and the Liberal Democrats. And I think the result of this is that in the outcome, you have very, very few Labour Lib Dem seats because there's no seat where that electorate was split between Labour and the Liberal Democrats. People either rallied behind Labour or behind the Liberal Democrats, right? But when it came to the right, you have a lot of people who prefer reform but think that the Conservatives are the best place to beat Labour or the Greens or the Lib Dems in their seat are still going to vote reform. And similarly, people who liked the Conservatives but thought it was a reform Labour race, they still voted Conservative. And so you have this massive split on the right where that really allowed Labour to take so many seats with very, very low vote shares. So you have a whole array of seats now where the vote is basically split between three parties, two parties on the right and one party on the left. So you have almost equal shares for Reform, the Conservatives and Labour, right? Which really shows how much of Labour's current coalition of votes is reliant on this split.
And do we know what the result would have been had Reform not been a major factor in this election? I mean, Nigel Farage very nearly didn't throw his hat into the ring, and therefore, quite plausibly, Reform would have been a rather lesser force within the election. So I guess one scenario that we consider is, well, what would Reform have been and what would the result have been had that decision not taken place? And I guess we can potentially go even further and consider, okay, imagine that Reform was the same as the Brexit Party in 2019, and what would the outcome have been in that scenario? Can we say anything about that at all, or is that just a slightly silly question?
I think it's a great question. And I think even we were analysing this like before Farage became the leader, right? And this didn't just happen overnight. You've had the Conservatives losing voters to other parties and to don't knows for the whole electoral cycle, right? So these voters didn't really know where they were going to go. They were unhappy with the Conservatives. We know that a lot of the time, these voters then go back to their main party, but the Reform option was already an option and it was already growing before Farage. So I think, yeah, these voters are very unhappy and maybe they wouldn't have voted at all, you know?
It's very difficult, isn't it, to put a number? I mean, that's a very difficult question, Alan, because, what you're saying is that let's isolate this one factor from all of these other factors and work out what the result would have been. I'm sure there are people working on that, just as when the Brexit Party stood down strategically and stood only in those seats that the Labour Party was defending. There's a calculation now of the estimated kind of impact of that. I'm just going to say, I think it was really important, right? So when we're talking about scale, when we look now at where Reform, where that split on the right is now a threat to the Conservative Party or a threat to the Labour Party, you're looking at hundreds of seats. And so it's not just what happened in the election in terms of the election outcome, it's what we're then left with. What do the constituencies look like now? So the impact last year would have been significant in the number of seats because British politics and the British electorate has really aligned into two blocks. On the right, Leave, sort of more socially conservative side, you've got Conservatives and Reform. So Reform really were the destination of choice for those Conservatives who supported Leave, because the Conservative coalition had changed over subsequent elections. And so the impact can be really big. Now, sorry, I'm totally avoiding a number, but it was big, right? But it's really big now too, because now you've got this knife-edge competition between 3 or 4 parties in so many places that a further split on the right can help Reform. That can do damage to Labour now, as well as help Labour. It helped Labour in many places in 2024. That's what Marta and I have shown in our Political Quarterly paper, just how much that split on the right helped the Labour Party. But that doesn't necessarily follow looking ahead. So it's a very big, significant impact. It's precisely because Conservatives really had mostly Reform or Don't Know or Abstain as their core options because of the way the Conservative coalition had changed over time.
We've talked there a lot about what the Conservatives did, what Reform did, tactical voting patterns. How much of Labour's victory was due to Labour? To what extent did Labour make any kind of difference to the result? I mean, I'm guessing, for example, that the fact that Labour kind of repositioned itself compared to the Corbyn era in the 2017 and 2019 elections made some difference here. But what can we say about Labour's role in this election victory?
So the big question then is agency, isn't it? Are we talking about context just determining everything, or how much agency did each of the parties have in the outcome? And, certainly you can't say that there isn't any agency. You can't say that those tactical decisions of where to place resources, where to campaign. The Labour Party obviously looked at those seats it didn't need to worry about and diverted resources away from them. That always happens. They obviously won seats they didn't expect to win, so there'll be a load of these games so they didn't place any resources. So you can't really say that was their strategic targeting. But yeah, I think the way to think about that is you're right. It's kind of, how did people see Labour as an option? And was the sort of ideological image of the Labour Party partly, just not being seen as a party that was less trusted than the Conservatives, that could marginally be seen as marginally better? I mean, we're still talking about major disillusionment and disaffection and not a great deal of trust in Labour. So Labour, of course, part of that is in there. Same with the Tories, their strategy, same with Reform and so on. But really, this was context. Really, this was a very lucky leader of the Labour Party going into an election with a set of factors that were largely not of his own making, in my opinion. I don't know if Marta, Paula agree.
Paula, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to come in and say the other thing that was kind of in Labour's control but not part of its active campaigning was how Labour was seen by those that might switch to the Liberal Democrats. So the Liberal Democrats believed strongly that in 2019 their failure to take seats that they thought they might was because of potential voters being really anti-Corbyn or afraid of a Labour government in some sense. And after Starmer became Labour leader, that disappeared. In fact, in some of the data, Starmer was more popular amongst Lib Dem voters than he was amongst Labour Party voters. He didn't have that push away factor that had been present in 2019. So things that Labour did may not have been. I mean, they certainly attracted some voters to themselves, but they also influenced the dynamics with other parties. And that dynamic with the Liberal Democrats was hugely important for the Conservative losses in 2024.
Marta?
Can I just jump in there as well and say that I think every voter, when they decide whether to vote for a party tactically, probably has a list of factors, subconsciously probably, that makes a party acceptable or not. And a party has to be part of the pool of acceptability for tactical voting in order to vote for that party, right? And I think that by moving to the centre, Labour definitely entered the pool of acceptable parties for many voters. So that's a massive part of this story. I don't think you could have had the same story at all with Corbyn's party in 2019. But at the same time, these same factors are the factors that might be holding voters to Labour now, even though there's a threat of reform.
I mean, I guess that fits in with the kind of Morgan McSweeney view of how to win the next election, that you win the next election by keeping the centrist voters who, that's maybe not quite the right word, but the voters who might be reform tempted in the camp, and you expect that the fear of people on Labour's left flank of a reform victory will be sufficient to keep them in the coalition as well. So you're kind of suggesting that the evidence that we see from the 2024 election is that that's actually quite a plausible argument, plausible analysis of the election dynamics.
With the big caveat, though, is that Labour's the incumbent now, and they don't have the Conservative incumbent to vote against. So if you're on the left, if you're a left, liberal, more progressive voter who might go to the Greens, who might go to the Liberal Democrats, who might go to independents, then, they've lost that critical factor, which is anyone but the Tories. And so keeping that coalition together isn't just about retaining reform voters, it's also about retaining Green and Liberal Democrat voters who might now look at a Labour government and think, well, what's the point? Is reform so much of a threat? Is Labour so much better? Now, many people will see that as being true, but not everybody. And you're relying on mobilisation, you're relying on engagement, you're relying on people to really want to vote in a certain way in an election, rather than look at all the alternatives and think, I'm going to sit this one out. So I think it's a very difficult thing to do, and the only way to do it is you risk alienating. Essentially, what you're saying is, well, if you go to reform voters, these people are sort of in the bank. They're just reliable. You can just count on them because reform is so scary to them. But actually, what you could also do is try to build consensus, find issues that don't divide, but bring that coalition together. And actually, because of Labour's low vote share, because of so much of that anti-incumbent vote, what they really need to be doing is growing their support, not just sort of trying to hold on to what they've got and count on the rest that, are going to back them regardless. So actually, they need to increase their support. They've lost a lot of support since last year already. They need to find ways to win that back. And it's not just going to reform. It's splintering in all directions and mostly to undecided. So that's what I think they need to be doing. And it's a broad appeal, not one that trades off some voters and assumes that others can be counted on.
Great, thank you. I hope we'll have time before we finish to discuss further the current situation and the future dynamics. But we've been sort of treading on the territory that's covered by Paula's article as well. So we should bring in that article fully and explore just what it says. So, Paula, you look at some of the sort of underlying drivers of voting behaviour in your article, and I guess we often have two sorts of models of what shapes voting behaviour, what sorts of factors people are taking into account when they decide how they're going to vote. One of those focusing, as a lot of our conversation has been so far, on the perceived competence of different leaders and parties. The other focusing more on a battle of values and ideologies and ideas and so on. You might want to say more about those models, do feel free, but also I guess I'm particularly interested in what does the 2024 election what light does that shed on the debates about those models of voting behaviour?
Yeah, so the paper kind of sets those two models not entirely against each other, although the literature often does. And some people writing immediately before and immediately after the 2024 election use this idea of a valence election because the Conservative Party had lost its reputation for competence, lost any trust that people had, was so disliked. So on there,
so that we should just explain. We haven't used the word valence before, so we should just explain what that means. Yeah. Okay, go for it. Sorry.
So the valence model says that they're the things that are important to voters, and that whoever can win out on those, whoever is most trusted, most competent, has the strongest leadership team, will be what voters choose because there's some sort of broad agreement on what voters want. They want certain types of delivery. I mean, in 2024, reduction in the cost of living, protection of the NHS were those kind of agreed things. And then they choose the party that can deliver that. And the Conservatives were just failing on all these measures. So at one level, the story of the 2024 election is simple. The Conservatives failed on all these measures. It's a simple valence story. We can finish there. Except if it was a simple valence story, you would expect those voters to primarily switch to the alternative government who could then deliver these things. And that's not what we see. What we see in 2024 is that the Conservatives lost huge amounts of votes, but they lost them in all directions. They lost small amount to Labour, some to the Liberal Democrats, lots to Reform, some to the Greens, a proportion that we don't yet really properly know to staying at home, all directions. And so what the paper argues is that it's those underlying value positions that people hold that explains where those voters went to. So having fallen out of love with the Conservatives in 2024, who they chose as an alternative depended on what their core values were. Now, by core values, I mean the kind of society we want to see. Okay, so it's not a prescription of how things are. It's what we would like the society to be like. And we often think of those as lying along two different dimensions. So we have a dimension that's about economics, quite often just termed left and right, but it's about how things like taxation, redistribution, nationalisation. And then we have another dimension, which gets called lots of different things, and which we could use a whole podcast just talking about what we should call that dimension. But for the time being, we'll just call it the social dimension. And it picks up things like attitudes to authority. It correlates with attitudes to immigration. It picks up those kinds of issues. So it's separate from people's economic position. And it's how those two dimensions combine to create distinctive groups within the electorate that helps us understand how they then choose different political parties. So we often talk about a group on the left that switches between Labour and the Greens, but actually what we mean by that is the liberal left, those people who are both left-wing on economics and liberal on these social issues. You mentioned, I nearly jumped in earlier when you talked about centrist voters, because you can only have centrism in any kind of pure sense if you talk only about one dimension. Because we're talking about two dimensions, you'd have to be in the centre on both to be talking about centrist politics. But it's those combinations that can be joined together. I sometimes think of the British electorate as like a little mosaic of fragmented pieces that you can stick together and make a picture that's big enough to win an election. But those fragments will break apart again. You've got to stick them together in a different formation to win another election. And that's the challenge facing the parties now. And it was the challenge between 2019 and 2024.
And it's interesting that you pick up on that point about centrist, what the meaning of centrist, because I stopped myself as well, because I guess when I was talking about centrist, I was kind of imagining that I was thinking about the swing voters in the middle of the system. But actually, the swing voters that at least Morgan McSweeney seems to be concerned about, I think, are the people in the left authoritarian corner of the spectrum. And he's worried about the swing between Labour and Reform within that quadrant. So not people in the centre at all, but they are in a sense at the moment perceived at least as being key swing voters.
Well, they're key swing voters because they're what we call cross-pressured. So they're left on one scale and right, authoritarian, however we describe it, on the other. So they don't fit comfortably within our party system. There is no party that is really trying to win that vote. I mean, leaving aside Farage's recent interventions on benefits and so on, nobody's really trying to win that vote. So they will, when economics are the really important thing to them in a cost of living crisis, they're more likely to be attracted to Labour. When immigration is the really important thing to them, they're more likely to be attracted to Reform.
And is it fair to say that that's because our party system fundamentally has been organised around the economic dimension for many, many decades, and really it's Brexit and the Brexit referendum that caused the second dimension, the social dimension, as you called it, to rise in prominence. And now we have parties trying to fight on that dimension as well, but actually being very divided on it. You're making faces at me, so I guess that's actually an oversimplification.
I think trying to distinguish cause and effect between the second dimension and Brexit, which is a bit of a chicken and egg question. Parties were already competing on that dimension before we had the referendum. The referendum correlated strongly with that dimension and kind of split parties apart along it. But which came first, I don't think I'd want to say definitively.
Yeah. Marta?
Paula, do you think there's also a relationship where people use the cultural dimension to find solutions for their economic grievances as well, right? So you could say that a lot of it is still about the economy, but immigration starts to matter because voters think that it's a solution for some of their economic grievances to some degree.
I mean, for sure, there's an interaction between the two, and people do the kind of immigration actually is a really poor example on that scale because it does bleed across both economic and social. But certainly, yeah, people there's an interaction between those two dimensions, which is really important to people. And we haven't got the time to go into it now, but the way the scales are measured rules out certain aspects of the economic dimension, critically attitudes to welfare payments, which come into that interaction between the two in really interesting ways.
And I guess we should also point out that pretty much all democracies have seen a rise in the second dimension, the social dimension of politics in recent years. So it's clearly not just Brexit that is causing that. You mentioned measurement there, Paula, which is a nice segue into another point that I wanted us to explore a little bit, which is actually how do we know about all of these things in relation to voting patterns in UK elections? And Jane, I mentioned at the start that you are co-director of the British Election Study, which is absolutely the premier study of electoral behaviour in the UK and the attitudes underpinning it. And both of your articles are based, I think, on British Election Study data and indeed many other articles in the Political Quarterly special issue. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the British Election Study and what its origins are, what it does, why it's so important in our understanding of elections?
Thanks, Alan. This is one of these gift questions where you get to do a little sales pitch. But it's just it's always an honour to talk about the British Election Study, and we've looked after it for a while now. But absolutely, we're just custodians of this amazing resource that supports all academics, as well as political journalists, as well as those members of the public who are very interested in politics through our analysis, through the research that we do, but also through our attempts to disseminate that. It's run since 1964 or 1963, depending on when you want to start counting it. And every single general election has contained a post-election survey. That's been a high-quality random probability survey. So that allows us to look at these very significant, big changes over time. So you talked about the rise of the social dimension. One of the things that we're able to do is analyse just the degree to which that's a sort of bottom-up story. Is it just inevitable, or how much of that is politics? We can look at those kind of long-term changes. But over time, the British Election Study has also expanded drastically. And since before we started looking after it, but also since 2013, when we started to have that responsibility for designing surveys and the analysis and the broader data infrastructure, we now have very large panel studies. So these are 30,000 people that are surveyed over and over and over. So many of the same people get re-surveyed. People drop in and they enter, and we are always refreshing that and making sure it's a representative snapshot of the population at large. But the primary reason to do that is to look at dynamics and change. We can look at people how they voted in the Brexit referendum, what they're doing now, how they voted in the last election, what they intend to do now, how they're responding to different political changes. And then the key thing then is that the survey items, the content, gives the broadest possible suite of different things that anyone would need to use if they wanted to understand British elections today, voters and non-voters. And so we try to ensure that this is by far the most broad, intellectually driven resource. It's not our pet project, it's there for everybody. And so those questions need to be there so that Marta can look at tactical voting. So it's not just enough, you could just look at constituencies. You can say, well, look, the Liberal Democrats picked up these ones. Those were the types of races. To understand it properly, you've really got to know what people thought. What did voters in those places think? That you can do with the British Election Study. We've tried as much as possible to ask Paula's values questions over and over and over so that she can look at change over time. And then those valence items and all of the things you might think are relevant in the long term, the sort of foundational structure of electoral behaviour, but also what's changing. What do we need to start asking about now because politics is always evolving? So that's the broad picture of the British Election Study. I haven't gone into various different aspects.
Yeah, but one of the nice things, I guess, is that it's all freely available, and it's freely available in a way that stats whizzes like Paula and Marta can analyze the data in depth, but it's also available in a form that someone who doesn't have lots of statistical training is able to go in there and find out the patterns on particular questions and do some simple analysis as well, which is really fantastic. Yeah, it is just an incredible resource for all of us that we're all very grateful for. So thank you, Jane, for that. Let's just before we wrap up, say a little bit more about the future and what we can say on the basis of this kind of analysis about the future. So we were having a bit of conversation earlier on about tactical voting and patterns in tactical voting. And I was very struck that you suggested that the absence of tactical voting on the right was partly because the incumbent party was on the right. And therefore, the other right-wing party, its voters, were not inclined to go to that incumbent. Should we expect, therefore, that patterns of tactical voting are likely to be different at the next election and that there might be greater willingness to vote tactically on the right and rather lesser willingness to vote tactically on the left? Marta?
So, to some degree, I think one aspect is tactical voting and another is just vote flows, right? So fragmentation is also part of this. So Labour needs to care about whether the right is unified or fragmented, right? It could become unified through tactical voting against Labour, but it could also become unified if all of the Conservative voters just switch to Reform or vice versa. And on the other hand, Labour need to be really careful about not losing their current tactical coalition. On one hand, they are the incumbents, so I do think it makes it harder, potentially, if they don't perform well, to lose that coalition of voters. On the other, tactical voting really depends on who is on the other side. We've seen across different contexts in Europe, France especially, how voters do rally around any party when that party is against the far right or a right-wing party. So reform could be as much of a threat as a Conservative government, and Labour needs to figure out how much they can kind of detach themselves from these liberal voters whilst these voters still voting for them. So it's a bit of a tricky question. And also the other important thing is that our paper really shows that not all votes are equal, and Labour, losing 1% of your vote share in specific seats can make your whole coalition crumble, whereas not in places where you have big majorities. So I think when we look at Labour voting intentions going up and down, it's important to really think about where these intentions are changing.
Jane, you were looking very sceptical when I was asking that question.
Oh, no, I was just struggling with something in my head. One of the things about last year wasn't just the anti-incumbent vote. As I said earlier, it was also the foregone conclusion nature of the election. So why could Labour win so many seats with its vote share going down, people staying at home because they were just secure, knowing Labour's going to win anyway? It was also an election where all the modelling, all the polling, these big analysis of projections from polls to seats were saying that Labour was going to win this big election majority and going to win it in the way that they did. Now, the next election is likely to be more tightly contested. People that didn't vote in 2024 are likely to turn out to vote in the next election. All things being equal at the moment, because the stakes are likely to be so much higher. We're not going to see. In fact, it's going to be really difficult for anyone to know what the outcome's going to be because it's so much more knife edge now. It's so much more sensitive to small changes. So can Labour count on those people that didn't bother to vote for Labour because they thought they were going to win anyway the next time around? Or is that reform competition going to mobilise people to the same degree? So it's not just about tactical voting, it's also about tactical non-voting. And Paul has identified several times, as we've been discussing, very importantly, that we can't analyse that yet. And that's because the British Election Study in-person random probability survey data, which also does its utmost to make sure we speak to people that didn't participate in the election and then to validate that as well to make sure that those answers are correct. That takes a long time to come out. So there's questions we don't yet know. I just say it's not just about tactical voting. It's also about the stakes that are placed on this election and how that changes mobilisation too.
Paula, do you have any kind of final reflections on what we can say about the present and the future on the basis of what you've analysed in your article?
So I think saying anything about the future at this point in an electoral cycle is daft. I'm gonna offer daft. Sorry, because if we were just to look back at elections where we've had a full electoral cycle and look at the same point as we are now, it actually wasn't very predictive of what happened later on. So if we look back at the last Parliament, we're still in Johnson's heyday in terms of the last Parliament. So much can happen in the future that is entirely unpredictable. And we're layering that on top of an electorate that are unpredictable, that are willing to move around between parties and that don't form big coherent blocks. And those two things make it really difficult to make any solid predictions about the future. But I think there's one thing that we know will continue and one big question. The thing that I think I'm confident will continue is that this underlying fragmentation will not go away. It could be that at the next election, some party manages to put all the pieces together and win 60% of the vote. That wouldn't mean that the fragmentation had gone away. It would just mean that that particular party had been really successful at bringing the pieces together. I think the underlying fragmentation is still there. I think the big question for the future, I've got this beautiful chart, which I cannot show you in audio, but on it, it's got that grey line, which shows the share of the vote for the parties outside the big three. I've included the Liberal Democrats in that. That shoots up in 2015. It dips away in 17 and 19 and shoots up again in 2024. And the big question is where that line goes next. Is it continuing upwards so that at some point we end up with the big parties actually being a minority share of the vote, or does it drop away again? And that's a big unanswerable question for the next election. I don't think I'd even toss a coin to try and find out the answer to that one.
So the moral is watch this space, and there will be much more analysis still to come. It has been such a privilege to be in a room together with the three of you today. Thank you so much. I could have asked questions all day long, but sadly we cannot do that. But thank you. Really great to hear your thoughts, Jane, Marta and Paula. We've been talking about two articles from the Political Quarterly's special edition on the 2024 general election in the UK. They are by Marta Miori and Jane Green. Their article is called The Most Disproportionate UK Election, How the Labour Party Doubled its Seat Share with a 1.6 point increase in vote share in 2024. And the second article is by Paula Surridge and is called Values in the Valence Election, Fragmentation and the 2024 General Election. There are many other articles, of course, in the special issue as well. That also deserve your attention on the role of gender and ethnicity, on the main political parties, on local campaigning, and on a range of other themes. As ever, you will find full details in the show notes for the episode. And if you haven't yet taken a look at it, do remember that Political Quarterly, our sister journal, is a journal that, much like this podcast, seeks to make the latest research about politics and policy accessible and relevant to wider audiences. So it is definitely well worth exploring. To make sure you don't miss out on future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics, all you need to do is subscribe. You can do so on Apple, Google Podcasts, or whatever podcast provider you use. And while you're there, we'd love it if you could take a moment of time to rate or review us too. I'm Alan Rennick. This episode was produced by Eleanor Kingwell-Benham and Kaiser Kang. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you for listening.